What I want to do in this clip is give a quick overview of some of the foundational concepts of the standard generative theory of phrase structure, with a view to justifying the following basic assumptions. First, all kinds of phrases are structured around lexical categories such as noun, verb, preposition, and determiner, and such notions as head, complement, and adjunct. Second, there's a single structural shell or template for all types of phrases, such that heads, complements, and adjuncts appear systematically in the same kinds of slots all over the language. And third, there are grammatical phenomena, such as anaphora, ellipsis, and emphatic focus, that operate in terms of the theoretical constructs at play in this kind of structural shell. With this in mind, I'll review and expand a little on the basic structure of noun phrases, and then show how and why this same structure works for verb phrases. Let's start out by going down to the level of a typical word around which a complex phrase can be built. The word student contains a suffix that in Latin created a participial stem from a bound verb root. In English, this suffix has the effect of turning an allomorph of the verb root study into a noun. And like with the verb study, the meaning of student is such that the concept of a subject matter that is engaged with in the studying scenario can be expressed by a word or phrase in a specific slot. If it is a single word such as psychology, this slot is on the immediate left of student, as in the case of psychology student. Otherwise, it's in a prepositional phrase headed by of on the immediate right, as in the case of student of psychology. Psychology student is a phrase of a kind that we call N-bar. Complements can be identified in the structure by the fact that they are always found right next to a head in an N-bar, P-bar, or some other bar-level phrasal container. This N-bar has the potential to combine with any number of adjunct modifiers. For example, we can add a word such as smart to specify an incidental attribute of a particular individual that we want to identify. As an adjective, smart designates a property of individuals that can be present to varying degrees, and because of this can be modified by a word such as really, which specifies a high degree on an imagined scale of smartness. By virtue of modifying the adjective smart, really is an adjunct in a larger containing phrase that has smart as its head. The structural signature of adjuncts is that they always combine with a bar-type phrase to create another enclosing bar-type phrase of the same category. Therefore, the adjective smart is enclosed in an A-bar shell so that it can combine with really inside another encompassing A-bar shell. This then is enclosed in an adjective phrase, or AP. Now, because this whole AP is in the same kind of modifying adjunct relationship with psychology student, it joins with it in a larger N-bar phrase. And of course, other modifying phrases can be adjoined to this N-bar. For example, we can adjoin a prepositional phrase to the right to indicate a place that we associate with the student in question. The N-bar formed by this adjunction, which encompasses the entire string of words, really smart psychology student from my high school, can be considered a complete noun phrase, or NP, for which reason it is enclosed in a shell labeled NP. This NP now needs a grammatical word at the highest level to create an overall phrase of a kind that can function as a subject of a clause or a complement of a verb or preposition. This is the function of determiners. So one option is to add a compatible demonstrative determiner. Because it takes a complement headed by a singular noun, the word this can be used. because the signature of this head-complement relation is containment in a bar-level shell. We enclose it in a D-bar before wrapping a DP container around the whole structure. The whole structure is consistent with our understanding of containment and constituency, both in the physical world and in language. Each of the units identified as a phrase is a complete piece that is part or member of a larger containing phrase. And we know what the containers and their contents are because of how they function in the grammar. For example, really smart psychology student from my high school, which is the entire complement of this, is identifiable as a constituent because it can be related to the pronoun one, whose function is to identify nominal phrases in the prior discourse that we don't repeat in order to keep our communication concise. Besides identifying whole NPs, one can be used in this anaphoric way to also identify N-bar constituents. In this same structure, for example, it can identify really smart psychology student as well as psychology student. We also have evidence that psychology is a complement of student. This is so because the model has psychology and the head of the NP, student, forming an N-bar together. Because of this, student is not itself an NP or an N-bar, and therefore cannot be identified by the pronoun one. And the general rule is that one needs to get its value from a phrasal constituent of category N, either NP or N-bar. Now, we can see that verb phrases, or VPs, have the same kind of shell structure by examining a complex VP built around the verb study. Let's go from the top down this time into the phrase, "Very often study my psychology notes on the bus." This can be decomposed into the adjunct modifier of the whole VP, very often, and a subphrase of category V-bar, consisting of the rest of the whole thing. Because it is typically a verb modifier and doesn't function as a complement, often is best analyzed as an adverb. It forms a constituent with the degree adverb vary, which, like all adjunct modifiers, combines with a bar-level phrase to create a bar-level phrase. The resulting adverb bar is enclosed in a complete adverb P shell that modifies a V-bar container for the rest of the VP. This V-bar phrase consists of a V-bar container for study my psychology notes and the PP on the bus, which functions as an adjunct modifier of the V-bar to which it adjoins on the right. Again, as an adjunct, it combines with a bar-level phrase to create an enclosing bar-level phrase. Inside the V-bar to which it adjoins, there is the V-head of the whole VP, which is study, and adjacent to it on the right is its DP complement, my psychology notes. This DP has the possessive determiner my as its head and the NP complement of my. This NP contains the noun psychology, functioning as an adjunct modifier of the N-bar container for the head of this NP, which is the noun notes. The PP modifier on the bus has the typical structure of a PP, with a P head and a DP complement. Some of the details of that structure are omitted here for the sake of brevity. In a way that I'll return to later, a VP needs to be a complement of some head in order to be properly contained in a complete sentence. For now, let's consider how the posited constituents of the VP are motivated by their behavior with respect to a grammatical phenomenon. In this case, I'll illustrate this with the phenomenon of contrastive focus, using what is known as the pseudocleft construction. Suppose I want to indicate that some part of what has been posited in a statement that just occurred in a conversation is not true, while at the same time affirming that the remaining part is true. Let's suppose you say that I like desserts and that I especially like chocolate mousse. I don't want to deny that I like desserts or even that I like chocolate, but I do want to assert that my preferred dessert is actually chocolate cake. To do this, I can say something like, no, hold on. What I especially like is chocolate cake. The pseudocleft sentence is, what I especially like is chocolate cake. And the phrase chocolate cake being at the end, right after a form of the verb be, is in the focused position. What's of interest about this construction is that it only allows phrasal constituents to occupy the focused position. So let's look now how this works with our VP structure. What I'm going to do is start out with a pseudocleft template for focusing on a part of a VP. This will have what I do, followed by a fragment of the VP, and then a form of the verb be, and the part of the VP that I want to put in focus. What I do very often is study my psychology notes on the bus. This is a perfectly well-formed sentence, and the fragment of the VP that is in focus is indeed a phrasal constituent in our model, as it is wholly contained in a V-bar part that contains nothing else. Similarly, I can put study my psychology notes in focus, leaving out both adjunct modifiers. And in the model, this fragment of the VP is the V-bar containing just the V-head and its complement. This pseudocleft construction gives us one of the most useful diagnostic tests for distinguishing adjuncts from complements. Although it is possible to focus on just a verb by itself, as in the case of what I very often do on the bus is study, this is only possible if the verb is enclosed all by itself in a V-bar. This happens whenever it does not have a complement. In the case of study my psychology notes on the bus, however, the verb is accompanied by a complement in the lowest V-bar in the structure, and therefore it isn't possible to focus on it. Of course, random fragments of the VP that do not form constituents also cannot be in the focus position, as illustrated by this ill-fated attempt to focus on the string, study my psychology notes on,